Australia's military history is more than a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who answered the call of their country of birth or adoption, and the enduring legacy they created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. Welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, a Doc Network podcast. Andrew Barton Paterson was born on the 17th of February 1864 at Narambla, near Orange in far western New South Wales. The eldest of 7 children to Andrew Bogle Paterson, a Scottish sheep grazier from Lanarkshire, and his Australian wife Rose Isabella Barton, who was related to Australia's first Prime Minister, Sir Edmund Barton. Barty, as he was known to friends and family at this time, enjoyed a bush boy upbringing at the isolated Buckenbar station on the crossroads to Dubbo in central western New South Wales. At the age of 5, his father lost his wool clip, or the total yield of wool shorn during one season, to a flood, and a drought the following season forced him to sell the property. When his uncle John Paterson, a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, died in 1871, the Paterson family moved to take over his property in Illawong, near Yass, in the south of the state. Yass currently sits on the Hume Highway, connecting Australia's 2 largest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. This highway traces the old route used by bullock teams, Cobb and Co coaches, drovers of their mobs of stock, and gold escorts, which would have been a familiar sight for the impressionable Paterson. His early education was in the form of a governess until he learned to ride a pony, after which he rode the 6 kilometres each way to attend the bush school at Binalong, the nearest township. This was followed up in 1874, at the age of 10, when he was sent to Sydney Grammar School, where he performed well both academically and as a sportsman. In his second year, he shared the Junior Knox Prize with future High Court of Australia Judge George Edward Rich. While there, he lived with his widowed grandmother, Emily May Barton, the sister of New South Wales Solicitor General and Legislative Assembly member Sir John Darville in Gladesville. Emily was a well-read woman who fostered Paterson's love of poetry and would continue to spend school holidays at the Illawong station with his family. While there, he would attend picnic race meetings and polo matches, where he would see the accomplished bush horsemen of the Murrumbidgee and Snowy Mountain regions. This skill in horsemanship, coupled with his love of poetry, undoubtedly generated his lifelong enthusiasm for horses and writing about them. Paterson would matriculate at the age of 16 in 1880, and though he failed the New University of Sydney scholarship examination, instead he served as a law clerk with Herbert Solway of Sydney-based law firm Spain and Solway. On the 28th of August 1886, Paterson would be admitted as a solicitor, and for 10 years from 1889, he practiced in partnership with John William Street. As a young man, Paterson joined enthusiastically in the Sydney social and sporting scenes, and was much sought after for his companionship. He was a keen tennis player and an accomplished oarsman, but his chief delight was still horses. He rode with hounds at the Sydney Hunt Club, became one of the colony's best polo players, and as an amateur rider competed at the now prestigious Randwick and Rosehill racecourses. His father had verses published in the Bulletin, a literary journal with a strong nationalist focus, soon after its foundation in 1880. And the younger Paterson would follow suit while as a law student. His first poem, El Mahdi to the Australian Troops, was published in the Bulletin in February 1885, serving as a criticism for the British war in the Sudan, though it would seem that his love of horses would influence the writing of his most famous ballads. Now, Andrew Paterson is not a well-known name in Australia, and even less globally. That is because that is not the name he's known for. Much like other bush poets of the era, Paterson wrote under a pen name. His happened to be named after the station racehorse owned by his family, the Banjo. He became one of the brotherhood of bulletin writers and artists from which the 1890s are remarkable in Australian literature. He formed friendships with E.J. Brady, Victor Daly, Frank Mahoney, Harry the Breaker Morant, and others. He helped Henry Lawson to draw up contracts with publishers and indulged in a friendly rhyming battle with him in the Bulletin about the allure of bush life. And while there was speculation at the time that the two men were bitter rivals, according to correspondence kept by both men, this literary rivalry was fabricated for the benefit of coverage in the newspaper. At some point in 1887, Paterson became engaged with Sarah Riley, and from 1895, Paterson had started to gain noticeable fame from his published bush ballads. Clancy of the Overflow, the Geenbug Polo Club, The Man from Ironbark, How the Favourite Beat Us, and Saltbush Hill were all published during this time, and became so popular with the readers that Sydney-based publisher Angus and Robertson published the collection under the title The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses in October that year. The title poem had swept the colonies when it was first published in April 1890, and the book had a remarkable reception. The first edition sold out within the week of publication and 7,000 copies in a few months. Its particular achievement was to establish the Bushman into the national consciousness as a romantic and archetypal figure. This was brought on by a surge of nationalism within the Australian colonies, which Paterson was able to ride with his poems. The book was as much praised in England as it was in Australia, and the Times compared Paterson with Rudyard Kipling, who he himself wrote to congratulate the publishers. Paterson's identity as the Banjo was at last revealed, and he became a national celebrity overnight. The same year, he collaborated with composer Ernest Truman to produce the operatic farce Club Life. Late in 1895, Paterson with his fiancée visited Dagworth Station near Winton in Queensland to visit a school friend of Emily's, Christina McPherson. And it is during this visit that Paterson composed his most famous work, the Bush Ballad, Waltzing Matilda, which is Australia's most well-known folk song, with Christina composing the score. Following this collaboration, Paterson was suddenly asked to leave the property, which has led some historians to speculate that he was having an affair with Christina, as the 8-year engagement was also suddenly called off. The breakup of this engagement didn't seem to slow Paterson down, as he travelled extensively throughout the northern Australian colonies for several years afterwards, writing of his experiences in both the prose and verse for the Sydney Mail, the Pastoralist Review, the Australian Town and Country Journal, and the Lone Hand, as well as continually working for the Bulletin. He was also commissioned by the Eastern Australian Steamship Company to contribute an article to the Tourist Guide, and by 1897 he was an editor to the Antipodean, a literary magazine. In 1899, when war was declared between Britain and the two independent Boer states of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, in what would become the Second Anglo-Boer War, Paterson followed fellow Bush poet Harry Morant in answering the call to war, though unlike the breaker, Paterson would not go to fight, but was appointed by the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age to be a special war correspondent, even if he had to fund his own transport and forego 6 months of pay to do so. His departure to South Africa in October 1899 was well reported, with poems penned by soldiers in his honour once it was discovered that he was aboard the troopship Kent with a contingent of the Volunteer New South Wales Lancers, who would join up with a Lancer contingent that had been training in England. Paterson's own writings from the journey gave some insight to the differing emotions associated with the colony's involvement in the Boer War, in that he reflects that the New South Wales contingent was only being sent because the Lancer officer in charge in England, Captain Charles Cox, proudly proclaimed at a public dinner that the Lions' cubs would come to the Lions' help, much to the chagrin of the New South Wales government, who apparently didn't want to send a contingent following the treatment of the colonial forces during the Mahdist War. While in Cape Colony, Paterson found himself attached to General French's column, the same unit that Harry Morant was assigned to as a dispatch rider. And while it isn't implicitly stated in either man's writings back home, considering this proximity, the Banjo and the Breaker must have crossed paths at least once. While in Cape Town, Paterson met fellow war correspondents Winston Churchill and Rudyard Kipling. Apparently, the press coverage of the Boer War was so extensive that, according to Paterson's writing, the military was complaining that there would soon be more correspondents covering the war than men fighting it. Paterson managed to secure the appropriate permissions to accompany General French to the front for 9 months instead of being herded with the other correspondents at Army headquarters in Cape Town, though apparently a chronic shortage of appropriate horses on his arrival threatened his movements, even though he did come with 2 mounts. While there, he met and wrote extensively about notable figures of the First World War, in particular Field Marshal Douglas Haig and General Edmund Allenby, who at the time were majors in General French's staff. Paterson was in the thick of the fighting, and his graphic accounts of the key campaigns included the surrender of Bloemfontein, where he was the first correspondent to enter the town, the capture of Pretoria, and the relief of Kimberley, which were published extensively in papers back home in Australia, even if he had the occasional clash with the press censor. The quality of his reporting attracted the notice of the English press, and he was appointed as a correspondent for the international news agency Reuters, an honour which he especially cherished in his later years. He wrote 12 ballads from his war experiences, the best known of which are the 3-stanza Johnny Boer and the 5-stanza sonnet with French to the Kimberley. After his 9-month stint in Cape Colony, Paterson returned to Australia in September 1900, and briefly made a lecture tour about his time in the war. Conversely, as the Second Anglo-Boer War occupied the time and resources of the Australian colonial armies, a second conflict was taking place much closer to Australia in China. A local uprising in 1899 against the foreign control of Chinese industry and trade, orchestrated by peasants before being supported by the government, headed by the secret society known in English as the Boxers. The Boxer Rebellion, also known as the Boxer Uprising and the Yangtian Movement, was an anti-foreign, anti-colonial, anti-Christian uprising and occurred in China between 1899 and 1901. It was in response to the harsh restrictions placed on Chinese people following the Second Opium War. British forces would join in a coalition of other Western imperial powers, Russia, France, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the United States, and allied Asian powers, Japan and allied Chinese governors, to essentially protect their interest in the region. Paterson was once again appointed by the Sydney Morning Herald in 1901 to serve as a roaming correspondent, first to the Philippines, where he spent a month during the Spanish-American War, before he joined the colonial naval forces of New South Wales, South Australia, and Victoria onto China. Unfortunately, by the time most of these contingents had reached the site of battle, the uprising had already been dealt with, and the Australian forces were predominantly occupied with garrison duty. While in China, Paterson met fellow journalist George Ernest Morrison, whose exploits Paterson admired, and the written account of this meeting is considered some of Paterson's best work of prose. Before returning to Australia, he travelled to London, where he was a guest of Rudyard Kipling, and met up with a colleague from the Bulletin, cartoonist Philip May. By 1902, Paterson was back in Australia and immediately published a second anthology of his work, titled Rio Grande's Last Race and Other Verses. 9 days after word had reached Australia about the trial and execution of Harry Breaker Morant, whose actions are outlined in episodes 9 and 10 of Season 1, on April 12, 1902, Paterson would pen Breaker Morant, remembered by Banjo Paterson, and publish it in the Sydney Morning Herald. Though the article didn't try to defend Morant for his crimes, it did try to paint a picture of a compassionate and charitable man who had fallen under the influence of ill-intentioned men. If you want to make your own opinion, check out the previous episodes. In November 1902, he decided to abandon his legal practice in favour of becoming a journalist full-time, going on to becoming the editor of the Sydney Evening News in 1903, and that same year he would marry Alice Walker at Tenterfield Station at St Stephen's Presbyterian Church in Tenterfield, New South Wales. The new couple would move to a property on Queen Street, Woollahra, near the centre of Sydney, and would welcome a daughter, Grace, the following year. He would continue to serve as editor of the Sydney Evening News until 1906, when the Patersons would welcome their second child, Hugh, that year. He would round out that year by publishing his first novel, An Outback Marriage. His next career would be the editor of the Australian Town and Country Journal until the call of the bush grew too strong, and in 1908, Paterson packed up to take over the 16,000 hectare, or 40,000 acre, property Coodra Vale near Wee Jasper, a tiny little hamlet at the foot of the Brindabella Ranges in regional New South Wales, not far from what would become the Australian Capital Territory. He decided to go into a pastoral pursuit, and when that failed, he turned his hand at wheat farming near Grenfell in far western New South Wales around 1912. In letters to his wife Alice, who along with the children did not join Paterson in the country, he laments about the poor conditions and the heartache brought about by lengthy drought and the tedium of judging horses being the only distraction. At the outbreak of the First World War, 49-year-old Andrew Paterson set sail aboard the transport HMAT A-14 Euripides on the 20th of October 1914, along with the 3rd and 4th Australian Infantry Battalions, bound for Alexandria as part of a fleet that he declared was one of the most wonderful sights an Australian ever saw. He set sail with the intent of being appointed once again as an official war correspondent, having missed out on the position as Australia's official correspondent to fellow journalist Charles Edwin Woodrow Bean, who had been elected by the Australian Journalists Association. Bean, in fact, had actually been mentored by Paterson during his time at the Evening Post. Paterson's intent was to travel on to England and use his reputation to be appointed as a British correspondent on the war in Flanders, and during his transit he routinely wrote articles chronicling the experiences of the convoy, including an account of the battle between HMAS Sydney and SMS Emden, an outbreak of food poisoning aboard the ships, and the issues associated with offloading and accounting for thousands of wide-eyed Australians let loose in a foreign country for the first time. On the trip across from Australia, he apparently drew on his bushman's experience in veterinary care by helping to treat an officer's horse that had fallen ill on the trip, and in doing so was appointed an honorary veterinary officer. During the voyage, he also was rather popular with those aboard, especially with those he had originally travelled with during the Boer War. After reaching Alexandria, Paterson commented that the Australians were disgusted at being put in a training camp in Egypt destined to be defending the Suez Canal instead of fighting in France. The first contingent of soldiers destined for the war left Western Australia on the 1st of November 1914, thinking that they were heading to England for training at the expansive Salisbury Plain before proceeding to the Western Front, much like the Canadian Expeditionary Corps did before them. But it was decided that the overcrowded military camps in England were unsuitable for so many men over winter and due to limited supplies, So the Australian and New Zealand forces were instead disembarked in Egypt on the 3rd of December 1914, as the climate was seen as more favourable for the troops to train in. The other reason why Anzac troops were offloaded in Egypt was hinted at in Paterson's own recollections. For 400 years, Egypt had been part of the Ottoman Empire as an autonomous tributary state until the 1882 Mahdist War, which resulted in Egypt and the strategically important Suez Canal becoming part of the British Empire. Because of the heavy loss of life on the Western Front, the decision was made that Australian and New Zealand forces would be off-shipped in Egypt to defend it against the threat of the then-neutral Ottoman Empire and to allow British forces to be recalled to France. And the Australian and New Zealand forces would assist in the defence of the vital trade route back to the South Pacific Dominions from an empire that had closer ties to the Central Powers than the Allies. While Paterson was in Alexandria, he made the acquaintance of the Surgeon General of the Australian Imperial Force, Colonel William Daniel Campbell-Williams, who invited Paterson to join him in England, claiming that the AIF was never going to see a shot fired in action in Egypt, and through his connections he could get Paterson on his staff and to the war in Europe, where he would be a correspondent who actually saw the war. Paterson was apparently sold on this plan, though he discovered that when he reached England, it was immediately following the costly British defeat at Mons, where they experienced dreadful losses and the British Army wasn't looking for reporters, but more soldiers. He would be unsuccessful in being appointed an official war correspondent, so he instead joined the staff of the Australian Voluntary Hospital as an ambulance driver. When the First World War broke out, Lady Rachel Dudley, the wife of the former Governor-General of Australia, decided to create a hospital drawing from the relatively large pool of Australian doctors and nurses who are in the United Kingdom undergoing advanced training. Much like matron Grace Wilson, whose life was the focus of episode 29 of this season, while the initial training of doctors and nurses could be undertaken in Australia, any advanced qualifications required a journey back to England, which meant that the medical personnel attached to this hospital would have been some of the most advanced trained Australia could provide. The hospital was officially offered to the British government by the Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Sir George Reed, on the 15th of August 1914. When Paterson joined them at Wimereux on Christmas Eve 1914, it was a well-equipped 200-bed hospital. It had motor ambulances donated by organisations in Australia, a pathology laboratory, and the only X-ray unit in the area, which would routinely see patients from other Allied hospitals in the region. For a time, the Australian Voluntary Hospital was the only Australian presence on the Western Front until the arrival of two mechanical transport companies of the Australian Army Service Corps when they reached Rouen on the 8th of July. While the hospital was initially successful and enjoyed an amicable working relationship with the British military officials, according to Paterson in his book Happy Dispatches, administrative and leadership issues resulted in the closure of the hospital and the offer of the British military to take over its operation. By all accounts, Paterson's tenure at the voluntary hospital was short, as for reasons I have been able to determine, aside from an article from March 1915 that stated that he had been frozen out by the military powers. He returned to Australia aboard the Euripides, and by his own writings, make no reference to any issues, only that he had abandoned any hope of being appointed an official correspondent. He returned to Australia to minimal fanfare. He, however, would not stay in Australia long, as considering his passion and experience with horses, on the 13th of October 1915, 50-year-old Andrew Barton Paterson would enlist in the Australian Imperial Force, apparently at the request of professional soldier and fellow horseman Sir Harry Chevelle. He would be assigned to the Second Remount Unit, despite being 5 years over the maximum age allowed to serve in the regular forces. Now, considering his fame and age, he had no need to enlist in the war, but he must have felt some call to do so. He would depart along with the 2nd Remount Unit from Sydney on the 10th of November 1915 aboard the troopship HMAT Orosova. The following day, he'd be promoted to captain. As I mentioned in the episode about Billy Singh, the Australian Light Horse units were not initially sent to Gallipoli owing to the rocky mountainous terrain being unsuited to mounted operations. However, by July, it had been decided that the Australian Light Horse and the New Zealand Mounted Rifles would be sent to the peninsula dismounted, their horses being left in Egypt with detachments left to take care of them. To free these men to rejoin their regiments, in September of 1915, 2 Australian remount units were formed with the express purpose of taking charge of the horses of the light horse regiments that were acting as infantry in Gallipoli, thereby releasing the trained officers, NCOs and men who had been left in Egypt in charge of the horses to be able to send as reinforcements. New Zealand would raise similar units of farriers who would take care of their own mounts. The maximum age for enlistment was set at 50 to allow for more experienced hands, and the units contained a high proportion of Boer War veterans and expert horsemen as a result. These men were also experienced blacksmiths, saddlers, and wagon drivers. They were responsible for the breaking, training, and delivery of replacement horses to the light horse. Paterson would return to Egypt on the 8th of December 1915, just prior to the Gallipoli evacuation on the 15th, at a time when it was determined that the initial purpose of the remount units, namely to free up troopers for the campaign, was now superfluous, as the troopers would be rejoining their horses by the new year. Instead of disbanding the force, British authorities in Cairo decided that the 8 squadrons of the 2 Australian remount units would be attached to the remount service in Egypt, essentially becoming part of the force responsible for the care, training, breaking, grooming of all horses and mules in Egypt. While the remount unit was primarily raised to look after the light horse, the first horses they took charge of actually belonged to the Australian artillery batteries who were arriving from Australia, and it wouldn't be until Christmas Eve 1915 that they would receive their first consignment of whalers for the light horse. In the interim, they were also lent their services to the care and well-being of the countless mules used for logistical support by the desert forces. On the 4th of March 1916, it was proposed that the 2 remount units would be reduced by half, each contributing 2 squadrons to a single remount unit. Those who weren't selected would be given the opportunity to join another unit or return to Australia. The following day, Paterson wrote his wife Alice from the Mahdi camp, which was the home of the 2nd Remount Unit, on this very topic, stating a desire to return to France, but noting a change in the AIF's experience now that the Ottoman Empire had entered the war. He also mentioned how the men under his command would appreciate any degree of hardship if it meant that they weren't just sitting around, as it would result in a change in scenery. He also commented the almost identical issue that he discovered in South Africa, namely the mules and horses of the unit being drawn away by other units, or in particular, officers, and the lengths in which the unit would go to keep their prize mounts out from under a red-collared staff officer. He ended the letter telling Alice to not be surprised if he returned to Australia that year. Paterson would actually be one of only 6 officers from the 2nd Remount Unit to be retained when the remount units were amalgamated, and would actually be appointed to the 3rd Squadron Commander. The remount unit would be moved to Heliopolis, and while there, Paterson would write his wife commenting that he had won the Squadron Cup in a riding match against his fellow riders in the unit. For reasons that escape me, there is a repeated mention in articles about Banjo Paterson that state he was serving in France as part of the remount unit. However, the unit diary of the Australian Remount Depot, the eventual successor of the 2nd Remount Unit he was assigned to, clearly makes reference to A.B. Paterson being in Egypt and the Middle East for the duration of the war, and considering his position within the unit, his departure would have been recorded. The only conclusion I can make is that his previous experience in the voluntary hospital was being included in his service in the AIF. It was in this unit during August 1916, prior to the Battle of Romani, that Paterson would hand over the unruly whaler Bill the Bastard to Major Michael Sanahan, an event that has been solidified in the legend of the Australian Light Horse, though Paterson himself would write very little about this. On the 1st of October 1916, the unit would be reduced again to 2 squadrons and was renamed the Australian Remount Depot. In response, Paterson would retain his position as Squadron Commander and would be promoted to Major the following day. The start of 1917 would see the Remount Depot beset by an outbreak of glanders, a debilitating and life-threatening bacterial infection that affects horses and mules, and resulted in the depot and the attached No. 16 veterinary hospital being quarantined. Testing would continue before the 4th of May 1917, when an outbreak of catarrh resulted in horses once again staying in camp. It would seem that in this time, Paterson would become concerned with the level and frequency of the men under his command becoming drunk, from homemade stills being constructed and the troopers routinely getting drunk. While Paterson admitted to enjoying a drink in his time, this experience made him, quote, feel inclined to join the absolute rabid teetotalers and shut up all the grog factories. How can you start to uplift men who get drunk at every opportunity? It was also during this time that he started referring to the remount unit as the horse-dung hussars, the Horsehold Cavalry, or the Methuselahs, owing to the average age of the men under his command and the apparent lack of actual duties undertaken by the unit. Despite the 1903 Defence Act at the time having provisions that declared Australia's First Nations people as exempt from military service, Paterson regularly wrote glowingly of a number of Indigenous troopers that had joined the remount unit from the stations that served under him in a manner that was relative to the times he grew up in, though was full of praise in their horsemanship abilities. Paterson was eventually sent to Moscar isolation camp in Egypt to command a motley group of men, including buck jumpers, circus performers, farriers, and veterinarians, in a camp that was used primarily as a training base for Australian and New Zealand infantry units. There they broke in thousands of horses and mules, shod them, fed them, groomed them, raced them, trained them for battle conditions, and kept the best of them for the ordinary frontline trooper. By June, Paterson became sick of Egypt. I guess one can only play so much tennis before it becomes tedious, and reflected to his wife a desire to apply for a position on the staff of the newly arrived General Edmund Allenby, who had just arrived after losing the confidence of Field Marshal Haig following the Battle of Arras in the spring, who would actually go on to command the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. July would see Paterson in the 14th Australian General Hospital suffering from debility, or a general weakness that had caused him to lose 13 kilos over a number of months. While he would recover, while he was in hospital, he commented to his wife that he shared the ward with a number of members of the Australian Flying Corps, including Victoria Cross recipient Franklin McNamara, Australia's first Air Force Victoria Cross recipient, who was recovering following the action that earned him Australia's highest award for gallantry. Paterson was back in camp at the start of August, where he lamented the lack of things to do instead of swimming, tennis, and horse riding. But that would change on the 19th of October 1917, when Paterson would command a contingent of 40 troopers to deliver 130 horses and 20 mules to Rafah in Palestine by driving them across the Sinai overlander style, in order to save scarce rail transport, a method that would have reminded Paterson of his childhood and is so credited with the participation in the Palestine campaign upon his arrival in Rafah 10 days later. Following the same route as Napoleon and Moses, he handed the animals over to a British advance section. While there, he was commended by the commander of the Remount Unit, General Bates, for the condition of the animals and cleared the contingent to return to camp as soon as they wish. Paterson, having been stuck away from the fighting for 2 years, instead requested permission to travel to the front to see the fighting, which the general obliged, and tasked his contingent with the delivery of 186 animals to the Australian Light Horse units, intending in participating in the Battle of Beersheba on the 31st of October 1917. Paterson would make another delivery of horses the following day, and marvelled at being able to observe the pivotal success of the desert campaign up close. In December, Alice, having joined the Red Cross, would sail for Egypt, and would join her husband in Morisca, having left their 2 children in the care of grandparents. For the remainder of the war, Paterson would approximately once a month lead a contingent to deliver animals in support of the Desert Mounted Corps' advance into Palestine, though at this point the unit diary for the Remount Depot becomes less detailed on the destinations. Following the armistice on the 11th of November 1918, the unfortunate task of what to do with all those horses and mules that had carried the Desert Mounted Corps to victory in the desert had to be addressed. Returning the animals to Australia was quickly ruled out, partly because of the disease threat they posed to Australia's livestock industry, and more fundamentally, returning them would cost more than the horses were actually worth. Selling the animals locally was also quickly vetoed by Lieutenant General Chauvel, commander of the Desert Mounted Corps, as there was strong opposition due to concerns on how the horses would be treated in the Middle East. Those animals deemed young and fit enough were sold to the British and Indian armies, and those deemed unfit for sale were destroyed by veterinary units. While the legend of this light horseman leading his weary animal out into the desert and only to return with a bridle, a saddle, and a mournful expression, it is romantic of the time, it does have some basis. In fact, it was not as widespread as people like to believe. Considering of the 9,751 horses still in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria by war's end, veterinary units accounted for the 3,059 animals deemed unfit for further service and were destroyed. There is no clear reason as to why this myth was propagated, although a misunderstanding of the official process, probably tied up with hazy memories and careless tellings of the real story, seems the most likely explanation. It is surprising, considering how much he wrote about his experiences in the Boer War and Boxer rebellions, that he never wrote a poem dedicated to the whalers under his care, or if he did, it has not survived. Though he was well aware of what was happening to the animals he once cared for, he however did produce some poems during the war. They're not nearly as famous as his earlier ballads, but the patriotism and larrikin spirit of the Aussie bushman shines through. By the time that the Remount Depot was being disbanded, Paterson was for a time appointed to the position of Commandant of the depot. Before he and presumably his wife, as Red Cross records did not constitute military records and thus weren't kept by any Australian agency, on the 2nd of April 1919 boarded the transport HMS Kildonian Castle at the Suez Canal bound for Australia. The Kildonian Castle had an interesting history just prior to this voyage, in that it was the last British vessel to sail from Russia during the end of the Russian Revolution. Paterson would reach Sydney on the 9th of May 1919, and after a medical checkup would be formally discharged from the Australian Imperial Force. After the war, Paterson resumed journalism, where he contributed to the Sydney Mail and Smith's Weekly, and in 1922 became editor of a racing journal, the Sydney Sportsman, an appointment he found highly congenial. In 1923, most of his poems were assembled in collected verse, which has been reprinted many times. He retired from active journalism in 1930 to devote his leisure to creative writing, and was by now a celebrated and respected citizen of Sydney. Most often seen at the Australian Club, where he had long been a member, and his portrait now hangs. In following years, he became a successful broadcaster for the Australian Broadcasting Commission on his travels and experiences. He also wrote his delightful whimsical book of children's poems and animals Noah Forgot in 1933. He published another novel, The Shearer's Cult, in 1936, and in 1939 he wrote reminiscences for the Sydney Morning Herald. That year he was appointed the commander of the British Empire. He would have a heart attack on the 5th of February 1941 and passed away at the age of 76. Survived by his wife and children, Andrew Barton, Banjo Paterson was buried in the northern suburbs Memorial Gardens and Crematorium, where he now resides with his wife, who would pass away on the 23rd of June 1963. So impactful was his life on Australian society. Both Australian soldiers from the Second Australian Imperial Force during the Second World War and United States Marines from the 1st Division United States Marine Corps marched to Waltzing Matilda during the Second World War, something I personally hope that he was alive to witness. The ballad is also used as part of the British Royal Tank Regiment's slow march of the Royal Tank Regiment, because an early British tank model was also called Matilda. Both the Marines and 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment continued to march to Waltzing Matilda, and in 2003, during the war in Iraq, the 1st Marines were based at Camp Matilda. It is truly interesting to hear American accents singing a truly iconic Australian song. In 1983, his granddaughters published a 2-volume complete edition of Paterson's works, including hereto unpublished material. His portrait by John Longstaff won the 1935 Archibald Prize and is in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and to further cement his place in Australian society, Paterson's image appears on the $10 note, along with the illustration is inspired by the man from Snowy River, and as part of the copy protection microprint, the text of the poem itself is on the banknote. The poem also appears on the Australian passport, and in 1977 it was almost Australia's national anthem. In 1981 he was honoured on a postage stamp issued by Australia Post. A.B. Paterson College at Arundel in the Gold Coast of Australia is named in his honour, as was the A.B. Banjo Paterson Library at Sydney Grammar School. The Festival of Arts in Orange, New South Wales presents a biennial Banjo Paterson Award for poetry and one-act plays, and there's also an annual National Book Council Banjo Award. Orange also has an annual Banjo Paterson Poetry Festival. In 1983, a rendition of Waltzing Matilda by country and western star Slim Dusty was the first song broadcast by astronauts to Earth during the first operational mission of the Shuttle Columbia. Eric Bogle's 1971 song, And the Band Played Waltzing Matilda, relates the story of a former swagman whose comrades got killed in the Gallipoli campaign, who he himself loses his legs, which is interesting considering that Paterson never actually wrote about Gallipoli. In all respects, I could continue to list Paterson's contributions to Australian society, but this episode is already running long, so I will leave it there with a final comment. On the night of Paterson's death, Vince Palmer broadcasted a tribute. He laid hold both of our affections and imaginations. He made himself a vital part of the country we all know and love, and it would not only have been a poorer country, but one less united in bonds of intimate feeling if he had never lived and written. By the verdict of the Australian people and by his own conduct, Paterson was, in every sense, a great Australian. Ballad rider, horseman, bushman, overlander, squatter, he helped make the Australian legend. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross Manuel, with additional research done by Laurie Favell. I'd really appreciate it, and it would help out the show if you took some time to share this with a friend, or leave a review on Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or iTunes, or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode, with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Don't worry, there's a link in the show notes. If you want to follow me for history-related hijinks and other nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at Doc Winters. Once again, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye!